I could stash things like my little water. So, pardon me for walking back and forth. If you take a moment and pray with me. Gracious God, may the words that I'm about to speak be acceptable to you, and may they be a blessing to this congregation. In your name I pray. Amen. Right, wrong, righteous. That's what we're going to talk about today. But first I want to begin with a little story. Some of you have asked me what I've been doing since you last saw me, and I'm able now to have a little more time to be outside and to enjoy the beautiful weather. And a few weeks ago I was taking a walk in a nearby park. The paths, as I was walking, I noticed that the paths were just literally lined with brilliant goldenrod. And interspersed with the goldenrod were some dark purple and brilliant blue asters. And it was just so beautiful. And other native plants had already kind of gone to seed, and some of the trees were already turning crimson at the tops. They were red and amber orange. It was really very beautiful. And the smell of autumn was noticeable. It was like an incense. I don't know about you. I remember when I was a kid growing up, we used to burn our leaves. And we all loved the smell, that smell of burning leaves. It wasn't just smoke. There was something else in it, like incense. And as I walked these goldenrod-lined paths, the air was filled with birdsong, mostly from goldfinches. Believe it or not, gold seemed to be everywhere, flitting about. And the bright sun lit up everything, and a true blue sky, salted with whiter than white clouds, hung like a bowl over this entire scene. And so as I walked this path, I'm immersed with this natural majesty and beauty of this prairie landscape, a feeling of praise just sort of welled up inside of me, and the words, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O God," just came to my lips. For a few moments, I felt unburdened of all my human cares and fears and concerns. And for a few moments, I really felt connected with all of creation. I felt somehow opened up to this divine presence that I sensed. But as we know, God is everywhere, right? Even the aches and pains in my body sort of fell away for a few moments. In my work as a chaplain, I've heard many people say that they feel closest to God when they're out in nature. And for some it's the mountains, for some it's the deep woods, and for some it's the shore. Perhaps you too have had a similar experience or experiences. So it's no surprise to me that for centuries and in almost all cultures, if not all cultures, temples and churches have been designed to incorporate aspects of the natural world. The Jerusalem temple in Jesus' time was just such a place. It was considered one of the most beautiful buildings in all the known world. Everything about the temple, from its elevation on the Temple Mount, to its white marble walls, to its golden decorations, were designed to create a sense of awe in the presence of the holy within the hearts of all those who came to pray and worship. In today's text in Luke, Jesus tells a parable about two men who go up to the temple to pray. But only one of them is opened to the transformative power of the Spirit of the living God. Only one of those two men. And we all know which one it is, don't we? We've heard this parable preached so many times before, and other parables in Luke 2, where he really kind of gives the Pharisee a hard time. So we know that it's not the Pharisee that's going to go home justified in God's sight. It's sort of become kind of easy for us modern Christians to come down pretty hard on the Pharisee. We know all about what's wrong with him. He is self-righteous. He's judgmental. He's hypocritical, intolerant, moralistic. You get the idea. In fact, in our day, the term Pharisee has come to be a synonym for hypocrite. There's a lot wrong with the Pharisee, and it's easy for us to look down on him. But in all honesty, there's also much that's right with the Pharisee. He is trying to be faithful to the law. He fasts, he tithes, and he avoids being drawn into bad company. As one commentator put it, the Pharisees preserved faith in God even under the crushing force of Roman military domination, and they preserved it by maintaining clarity about the way the goodness of God ought to shape all faithful life. The Pharisee was kind of in a hard place in that era, trying to maintain the Jewish law and customs and ways in the face of the encroachment of the Roman Empire with all of its secular ways. And furthermore, this prayer that the Pharisee prays, which we tend to hear as kind of arrogant and self-absorbed, it's really quite similar to a prescribed prayer right out of the Old Testament. So it was a certain style that was just part of the way the Pharisee worshiped. So I guess I should say, or we should be cautious in our judgment of the Pharisee. We should sort of try to set that aside a little bit. Now, likewise, the tax collector. I don't know anybody who really enjoys having, company of tax collectors. If they call you up or come to your door, I'm sure it's going to make you a little anxious. But tax collectors in our society today are not like the tax collectors of Jesus' time. There's many things wrong with the tax collector in our story if he is like the tax collectors in general. Well, first of all, he worked for the enemy, the Roman Empire, who forced their oppressive rule upon the Jewish people. It'd be sort of like, if Russia ever did conquer us, that some of us would go to work for Putin, It would just be, that would just be a hard thing to do. And it would probably cause us to be ostracized. But secondly, his position was to collect taxes from the people. And he routinely collected more than was due in order for him to make a larger profit for himself. And the means by which he went about collecting the tax, well, is probably pretty reprehensible. Probably was something like close to extortion. The tax collector was intensely disliked by the people, and he was feared as well. He was kind of like the bully. And because he handled money and served Rome, he was considered ritually unclean. So the tax collector might have lived on the margins of society. He probably was ostracized, but he was anything but poor. Tax collectors tended to be well-fed, and his life was very likely quite far from being righteous. But there's something right about the tax collector. At least on this day, when he went to the temple to pray, he was just open to experiencing the presence of God. I'd like to think this tax collector had an experience something like mine when I took that walk in the park. I like to think that the majesty and the beauty of the temple brought to his lips the words, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord." I'd like to think that deep within him arose a sense of his own connection to all of creation, followed quickly by a realization of his own situation before God. A realization where he saw how his own behaviors jeopardized that very creation that he was now experiencing. how his own behaviors betrayed God's laws and destroyed the harmony and justice of the community. Seeing himself so clearly, he gave up all his defense mechanisms and simply prayed from his now opened heart, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." It's a simple prayer, but it's a very powerful prayer. And the sad part is, that Pharisee, he was so focused on his own contempt of certain kinds of people that he didn't even notice how the Spirit of God was moving in the temple that day. He didn't even notice the work that the Spirit of God was working in that tax collector, in that sinner. And that's sad in my mind. And probably happens all too often when we gather for worship. Not because we are just, bad people, but sometimes we're distracted by other things. So as I reflected on this parable, especially in light of what's been going on the past few weeks in our election cycle, I'm sorry, we're never supposed to talk about politics in church, right? It's really dangerous for a pastor to do that, but I'm the guest pastor. But I have to say, that I've never experienced anything quite like our current election cycle. But as I reflected on this parable, a pair of words jumped out at me: righteousness and contempt. And that's what I want to focus on. Remember how Luke introduced the parable? He said, "Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt." Righteous, contempt. Now, righteousness, that's a word that's almost as uncomfortable to our modern English ears as the term Pharisee. As Marcus Borg pointed out in his book, Speaking Christian, people tend to think of the term righteous in negative ways, such as holier than thou, legalistic, moralistic, hypocritical, and so on. All those words that we could apply to the Pharisee. But in the Bible, the word righteous is a positive word that is closely related to the concept of justice. Justice is also a word that we sometimes have trouble with. When I say justice, I'm not talking about justice in terms of punishment for doing wrong, but justice in terms of creating a just social and economic and political order. Justice means creating a world where the material necessities of life are fairly distributed to everyone. Going one step further, many religious thinkers today think of the term righteous and righteousness in terms of creating right relationships. Right relationships with each other. Relationships where we collaborate rather than seek to dominate. Relationships where we show respect instead of contempt. Relationships where we grant each other grace instead of instant condemnation. Right relationships, both with God and with each other, and with us and all of them out there in the world. And contempt, on the other hand, creates divisiveness that destroys relationships. Contempt is variously defined as the feeling that a person or thing is worthless or beneath consideration, or the act of despising or showing disdain for one another, or showing an extreme lack of respect accompanied by an intense dislike or a sense of superiority. Now, John Gottman, a noted psychologist and researcher into marriage and family relationships, he has the uncanny ability to predict with a 91% accuracy which relationships will succeed or fail over the long term. And he can do that by just a few minutes of watching how a couple or how a family interacts. He bases his predictions partly on the presence of four destructive communication styles that he labels the four horsemen of the apocalypse. straight out of the book of Revelation there. So the 4 styles are criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. Of the 4, contempt is the most destructive. Gottman has found that the presence of contempt in a relationship is the #1 predictor of divorce. Contempt is treating others with disrespect, and it takes many forms: sarcasm, name-calling, hostile humor, body language such as eye-rolling and sneering. In whatever form contempt takes, it is poisonous to relationships because contempt conveys disgust. Contempt escalates conflict and leaves little room for reconciliation. That's what Gottman had to say about contempt. So contempt, though, is not only toxic to our most personal and intimate of relationships, it also poisons the well of our public discourse. I can think of no time in my life, and I'm old enough by now to say back in my day, I guess, but I can think of no time in my life when political campaign speeches have been so full of thinly disguised hatred and contemptuous language. I say no wonder our government is gridlocked and our country's mood is more and more polarized. A professor named George Saunders wrote a piece about the 2000 campaign for the New Yorker a while back. It was a very long piece, but a key quote that I took from that is this. He said, "Intellectually and emotionally weakened by years of steadily degraded public discourse, we are now 2 separate ideological countries, left land and right land, speaking different languages. In our collective political life, we have often become like the Pharisee, rolling our eyes at one another with disdain, shouting accusations while tooting our own horn, and generally throwing the common good under the bus. And many of us are afraid to say anything, at least in public, for fear that any attempt at honest and respectful discussion of the issues will too quickly degenerate into something destructive." And sad to say, even in the church as a whole, where the Christian virtue of humility ought to count for something, we are too often at one another's throat, criticizing and dismissing those with different viewpoints. And yet, as a church, we must respond with humility and respect. How might we live in this age of polarization? So I'd like to answer that by sharing some thoughts from an evangelical pastor and professor, Ed Stetzer, who writes a blog on Christianity Today. Last November, he wrote an entry titled, "3 Ways Christians Can Be Like Jesus Amidst a More Polarized Culture." So here are his 3 ways. 1, listen better to people who disagree. 2, love people despite their disagreements. Maybe we should love people because of their disagreements. That would really be a challenge, wouldn't it? 3, lead people to understand what we believe. I'd like to give you a little snippet of what he said about each one of those topics. 1, listen better to people who disagree. In order to understand and grow, we must choose first to listen. We must remember that the way we often win the ears of others is by learning to use our own. We follow a man named Jesus who commanded us to tell the world about him. And if we're too busy yelling, we'll never make time to tell them that someone loves them and enough that he came to die for them. And they won't likely listen if we do. Who likes to be yelled at? Listen better to people who disagree. Number 2, love people despite their disagreements. He says, we must love people even if we don't agree with their points of view. Unfortunately, the church is not known for loving people who are different. Our tendency is to keep outsiders outside, if not pushing them even further away. Others adhere to a culture war narrative that has Christians crushing and hating enemies, rather than loving those who hate us and doing good to those who despise us. Words matter, even online, and the more we use our words to hurt and create division, the less opportunity we will be given to use our words to love. Love people despite their disagreements. 3, lead people to understand what we believe. We need a renaissance of evangelism that grows from relationships. The key word there, relationships. We must be more willing to show and share the love of Jesus. We can't expect people to want to hear what we have to say about Jesus if we make ourselves a banging gong or a clanging cymbal on other, less eternal matters. If our lips and our lives don't align, we really have nothing at all to say. That's a pretty strong critique from a man who has been a pastor and a professor and a writer for many, many years. And he's on the opposite side of the theological divide than I am. But I found his words very enlightening. So maybe we should all try to read articles and from people that we wouldn't normally read. That might be one way to kind of get ourselves accustomed to hear what people from other viewpoints have to say. Right, wrong, righteous. If we enter God's lovely dwelling place with most of our attention on what is right and wrong with the world and who is in and who is out, then we are likely to miss God's presence altogether. We are likely to miss, or at least dismiss, the sinners, that would be all of us really, in our midst, and the transformative work that God is doing in their lives and in our own lives. Right and wrong matter. They do matter. But relationships, right relationships, matter more. Righteousness in terms of creating a just world where we treat one another with respect and dignity. Righteousness in terms of creating right relationships with God and one another. Righteousness in terms of cultivating compassion for one another in place of our human tendency to react rather than respond with contempt. So here's the good news. The good news is that we don't have to do this all by ourselves. We simply need to place our trust in God's strength rather than our own strength. We need to place our trust in God's understanding rather than our own understanding. God is ever ready to bless us and make us a people of blessing. And I must say that the congregation here at St. John has been, in my experience, always a people of blessing. So let us open our hearts to that truth and take it with us each and every day as we seek to live more like Jesus in this polarized culture. Amen.